Welcome to Rick on Life, brought to you by the Liberty Beacon Media Project. I'm your host, Rick Amitin, and this is where we talk about things that impact our daily lives. We're going to continue our discussion today on faith in the 21st century. I'm joined by my insightful guest co-host, Tammy Dempsey. Hi, Tammy. How are you?
Hey, I'm doing great.
Glad you're here with us today. Is the glass half full or is it half empty? It's a popular expression, a proverbial phrase that's often used rhetorically to indicate whether a person is pessimistic or optimistic, and it's often kind of used as a sort of litmus test to be able to ascertain how somebody looks on the world. I personally tend to be very optimistic, but I get very grumpy when I'm pushed by events or the environment or even personalities into a pessimistic outlook. Negativity just isn't very compatible with me, and I don't like it. According to the DISC personality profile assessment, people fall into two predominant categories. They either see the world as friendly or they see it as unfriendly. And we form these outlooks based on a few factors, contributing factors. One is genetics. We can actually inherit some of our cultural attitudes. And two, we can be very affected by our role models up to about age 12. And thirdly, our life experiences, especially after age 8, can greatly affect our attitude, our outlook, and whether we see the world as a half-empty glass or a half-full glass. Life events and how we experience the world will either reinforce or alter the path that we've been set on from our young childhood. Even in matters of faith, when it comes to faith, an incorrect understanding of God is very problematic. It's problematic in our individual lives. It's problematic in how we engage in society. And it's problematic when it comes to our worldview and how we see the world at large. If God is omniscient, and I believe that He is, an incorrect understanding of God is going to give us a lot of problems. It's not possible for human beings to know everything there is to know about God, but some things are very knowable, like God is love. And I believe that God is thinking about us as human beings. And I believe that when He thinks about us, He's thinking good thoughts toward us. He's not angry. Took me almost a lifetime to figure this out. But God is not angry. And He isn't sadistically looking for an opportunity to execute His wrath or His vengeance or His judgment to destroy us. So when it comes to faith, I think we have to address the area of fear. Fear plays a huge part for a lot of people who are involved in faith, who practice faith, who structure and live their lives according to faith. So there's a history that I have as a personal experience. I was raised Pentecostal, and in my religion, there was a lot of emotion and a lot of fear. Fear that for the most part was artificially induced. Because fear-based faith is unstable. And it has a lot of side effects. And these negative side effects can remain for an extended period of time and even indefinitely. For instance, hell was preached so hot to me as a child that in one particular church service, I must have been 8, 9 years old, a church of 400 or 500 people, just a young boy sitting on the second or third row. And the descriptions of hell and the intensity in the way that it was described had such a profound effect on my young mind that I actually felt warmth on my leg and looked down to see if it was on fire. That creates a tremendous amount of fear. Tammy, jump in here. You came from the same background religiously. How did you experience, or did you experience, fear as a child growing up?
Oh my. The fear of going to, I did not want to go to sleep without repenting in case if I die before I wake. As a little kid, it was a practice to say, God, whatever I did today, please forgive me. And the fear of the rapture, my mom, if I came home from school and my mom wasn't home, the fear, the terror, if I couldn't find her in a store or something like that, it was immediate, just over the top terror.
Yeah, I was a teenager and decided to smoke cigarettes with some other kids.
Shame on you.
And I was, of course, taught that was cause for eternal damnation. And the whole idea of being this imperfect person and not being pleasing to God and played into the whole concept. So later that night, I was in my bedroom and laying in my bed and started thinking about what I had done wrong and actually put myself into a real state of panic. And my grandmother, who was the spiritual influence in our family when I was growing up as a kid, I had so much faith in her that this idea of the rapture, which is Jesus returning to the earth and taking his chosen people out of the world, whether or not you could be in that group or would be in that group, was always, up for debate. And you could be in it if you thought you were doing well and be out of it if you stubbed your toe or did something wrong or committed, some act like smoking a cigarette. But I realized that I had to do something. I was really frazzled. And so I went to the telephone to call my grandmother, simply believing as a young boy that if my grandmother was there, the rapture didn't take place, Jesus didn't come and take his people out of the world, and I wasn't going to be condemned to hell, at least not at this moment. And so I called on the telephone, and my grandmother didn't answer the phone, which was alarming to me. I had an aunt who answered the phone, And I loved my aunt very much. And she was a person of faith. But I obviously didn't have the same level of comfort with her that I had with my grandmother.
Right.
And I said, is grandma there? And she said, well, yeah, she has a migraine. My grandmother suffered with migraines for many years. And so she was often had to lay down with a cold face cloth on her head. And I said, well, are you sure she's in the bedroom? And my aunt, sensing that something was not right, she said, well, what's wrong? What's going on with you? And I said, I did something I shouldn't have done, and I think the Lord has come and has taken his people, and I'm left behind. So let me ask you, if the Lord came, do you think that you would go? And she said, well, I think so. And I said, oh, that's not good enough. You got to go in the bedroom and you got to make sure that grandma is in that bed. And because that's where my faith was, where my security was. And so she actually did put down the phone to go to the bedroom, but she told my grandmother what was going on. And so my grandmother came to the phone and we spoke. And I can't tell you how that fear left me at the sound of her voice. This fear is very real. And it's something that people who are not involved in faith criticizes us for. That we would do this kind of fear, introductions of fear into young children. And because science will tell us how many negative effects can be traced directly to fear, create all kinds of eating disorders, medical problems, mental anguish, depression. I mean, there's so much that can come from fear. And when we talk about faith in the 21st century, we really should have moved on to a larger understanding of the inappropriateness of fear when it comes to faith. Fear and love just do not coexist and aren't good for us. And it gives us fundamental misunderstandings that lead to all kinds of other things that we end up having to deal with when it comes to faith. This was so profound in my youth that after I had joined the service and I was in Okinawa, Japan, and I had sort of gotten away from my faith and church involvement and that culture and climate, but someone in my church back home made it a part of their life to communicate with our men and women, young men and women that joined the military. And she did this by letter writing, and occasionally we were using cassette tapes back in the 70s, and she would send a cassette tape of a church service. Well, I received a letter and a tape of a church service when I was in Okinawa, Japan. Because of our hours and the way we worked over there, I had worked all weekend, and so it was Monday, which was a day off for me because of my weekend duty. So I took a tape player and I put the tape in and I listened to the message. And it brought me back into this fear that I was separated from God, on the outside of God. And as I let my mind go into all of these possibilities of horrible things that could happen to me. Now, I'm a young man now in the military, laying in my bed in the middle of a huge squad bay where 40 guys lived. And our beds were kind of raised up a little bit. so that your foot locker would fit under the bed. But after the tape was finished and I was dwelling on what I'd heard and my memories and my personal condition and where I was, and I felt what I thought was evil pulling me down. The sensation I had was that it was pulling me down. It was so real that I jumped off of my bed to look underneath. I don't know what I expected to find, but something had to be there, pulling me down. And in fact, someone else that was off that particular day in my squad bay, fellow Marine, happened to be walking into the barracks at that moment. He saw me jump off the bed and look under my bed, and he said, well, are you all right? What's going on? You act like something under your bed. I said, oh, I thought I heard something. I didn't really want to get into it and explain anything, so I got back in bed. But it's more than just somebody's personal responsibility for making me afraid. It was more than just that that idea that you need to be concerned that you're pleasing God. It was much more bigger than that. It was now a culture that had surrounded my experience. And while my relationship to God then was based on fear, it was very hard to believe that he was a loving, unconditionally loving, kind God that had only good intentions for me when my idea of him was fear-based.
Right.
So there was a lot that I had to work through, and I carried much of this erroneously. We all at some point must become responsible for what we believe. But it took me a long time. I had been an adult for many, many years, where this fear played a significant part in my life and in how I related to God and in my understanding of God. So elaborate a little more on your experience where fear is concerned.
Oh, I mean, it was standard. Like, that's basically how I was kept in line, was fear.
Well, kept in line in what way? I mean,
kept in line. Well, that experience I had where somebody said prophet said I was a disgrace to my father and his ministry. It also translated over, I was a disgrace to God. And so I was scared into a very, I'm a rule keeper by nature. What do they call it? Compliant by nature. So I am naturally that way. So you take somebody naturally that way and then you add fear to it. It was, I was really in a prison. I call it my 2 foot by 2 foot pedestal prison. I was literally afraid, terrified to think out of the box, to question anything, to, if I had a question, a few times I was brave enough to say something, and of course the reaction scared me right back into my 2 foot by 2 foot pedestal. But I was one of those, I was the good girl, and I literally didn't breathe without permission. I don't even know how to explain it, but I was not alive and vibrant and I was very serious, straight-laced. A lot of teenagers, the fear didn't work on them. And, we'd go to youth convention or whatever, and they would do all kinds of stuff. Never me. I never put on something I wasn't supposed to wear. I never went somewhere I wasn't supposed to go. I never listened to music I did not do it because I was scared to death.
I was much different. I did it, and then I was scared to death. I thought the consequences are going to be horrendous, and then I would quickly want to correct that. And there were, our upbringings were so different, but I do think that you have to be, because I noticed that too. I noticed that kids did things and they just didn't seem to broke the rules, violate whatever, but they didn't seem to have the same struggle that I had. And so I think that there are a lot of factors that can play into it. But anytime, how they approached making peace with God when they didn't seem to have any real concerns about breaking the rules. And so we do probably have some type of bent or openness toward this having that kind of an effect on our lives. But I just don't believe that it is appropriate. I don't believe that it is necessary. And I think living in fear makes it very hard to understand who God really is and how he relates to human beings. And I think you can stumble over so many things that are helpful, beneficial, that can add so much substance to your life, that if it's simply a fear-motivated experience, it's kind of tough to deal with and make significant progress, because in your mind, anything that you do that's not perfect will put you right back into fear. And fear and conviction and maturity and understanding and growing in your faith are not compatible, because this fear is going to keep everything very unstable. Where do you actually gain peace of mind? Where do you get abundant joy? Where do you get this sense of security that you're ever in a safe place if you're always feeling fear? It's not the same as guilt for behavior, something that you knowingly did that's wrong. Not even a matter of sin. If I was rude to somebody, guilt lets me know, hey, that's not appropriate. If I'm uncivil, if if I'm harmful to somebody else, we get that sense of guilt, that understanding that behavior is wrong, it's unethical, it's all of those things. But to actually live in fear because when it goes beyond being able to correct it simply by saying to somebody, I'm sorry I spoke to you that way. Forgive me for doing that. I didn't mean that the way that it came across. You rectify it, you correct it, you move on from it. But this fear is something that becomes inbred and doesn't leave you. And when you are afraid, you make yourself very vulnerable, is what I'm trying to get to. And so that vulnerability then allows for all kinds of additional things to happen in our lives that can be incorrect, abusive, manipulative. There's so many other additional things that can come when really what makes it all possible is fear. And
can I make a comment there?
sure, yeah, jump in.
For me, fear, it's like this. If you're living in fear, if you take it outside of religion and just maybe into an abusive household, if you're living in fear and what you're seeing is a fear controlled, it's hard not to separate power from fear. Fear becomes, you have power, there's the powerful and there's the fearful, and you're either on one side or the other. And at some point, we often will go from hating it, we're tired of being fearful, and so we switch over to the powerful, and we find our own people to exert fear and control over. Does that make sense?
Well, yeah, it becomes a cultural. It becomes
I'm tired of being
culture. Go ahead.
I'm tired of being afraid, so I'm going to step into the only way that I see power. And that's what happened to me.
Well, it becomes a culture that we operate in, and we make ourselves almost feel better if we can make somebody else feel worse, which again creates something very unstable. And it doesn't represent the love of God or who he really is toward other human beings. It can lead to a lot of what I would classify as spiritual abuse. I came from a broken home. I was abandoned by my father. I had 3 stepfathers by the time I was 9 years old. I often found myself living with my grandmother or an uncle, put off on somebody else. I ended up being molested, which opened up all kinds of other emotions I was not ready to handle, which increased all of these aspects, increased my vulnerability, made me very susceptible to abuse, manipulation, because like everyone, I was looking for love. I was looking for security as a young child and even as a young man. I wanted a sense of belonging that I didn't have, and certainly everybody has access and belongs and fits into this kingdom of God and have to have a relationship with your heavenly Father in that sense. So I was a real candidate for manipulation because I saw myself as damaged. I wasn't worthy. I sought to make myself acceptable, trying to satisfy this notion of an angry God. I wasn't able at that point in my life to reason things out or to understand the true nature of God and how he relates to human beings. And so it allows for a lot of abuse by people who assume authority that's not theirs, and it creates a culture, an entire culture that's based on fear and manipulation. And so you're very prone then to a legalistic mindset. Just give me the rules. If I keep these rules, I'm who I need to be. If I keep these rules, I'm everything God wants. If I keep these rules, God can't help but love me and be good to me. And it's you stop right there. And your relationship becomes one of rules and regulations and conformity and fitting in. And it doesn't really take you on to a healthy, wholesome relationship with God. And for people who are driven like myself, I drove into a wall with these concepts and these ideas. And it wasn't until that point that I began to unravel my emotional, intellectual, and religious knots and come to a much deeper understanding of who God is, who I am, who we are to each other, and how it all fits together. Am I making sense here? Am I explaining it?
I think so. I mean, I have my journey and you had yours, definitely trying to untie the knots.
And the knots were really, for me, they were knots of fear. You know, they were knots of misunderstanding, but they affected my whole being, not just, you know, in the area of faith. It affected my whole life. It's the way I've approached and viewed and experienced life, and the way I made decisions. Always trying to find some other way to appease, to thwart off and shoo away harsh and bitter and even eternal judgment. When you're in that kind of a place, it's easy to be told what to think, what to feel, how to dress, how to spend your money, how much you should give to the church. Shame becomes a basis to allow fear to just run rampant in your life. And when you're shame-based, which I was, that deep sense of unworthiness, that deep sense of not belonging, so afraid that I wasn't good enough, wasn't right. I could go so far in thinking things were really going to have a happy ending, and then they don't work out. And instead of you realizing that you're just using wrong principles to build your life and base your life on, you're actually being driven by the fear that isn't even real. It's not authentic. It's not genuine. It's not connected, you know, to God or what's meaningful. You know, this whole idea about abuse and being afraid. I remember back in 1988, a book was written entitled 88 Reasons Why the Lord is Coming in 1988. It wasn't the first time that something like this had been introduced to the faith-based community. We'd gone through it a number of times. And when you jump on these things and you take the fear that gets generated around all of this, it creates a buzz. It creates a lot of activity. It can create a lot of emotion. A lot of decisions get made during the climate of this being a legitimate, impending, worldwide event. And you need to really, you know, take this serious. And I had gone through a number of these things, and I had gone through this whole fear-based thing. And I you know, oftentimes the people who are demanding that you toe the mark and very legalistically live your life, I watched as many of those in authority abused their positions. There was this element of hypocrisy, where people were demanding perfection from you, when just a casual observation would reveal that they weren't perfect human beings. And yet, because your sense of unworthiness and your sense of not being good enough and your sense of not belonging, you could find yourself manipulated and subjected to that kind of abuse and authority and leadership, because at the root of it, you were afraid. No matter what they did, you were afraid that somehow this was, not tied to just the human experience, but your particular experience. And I remember going to a meeting where the man in charge had exercised considerable efforts to authenticate the legitimacy of the book, 88 Reasons Why the Lord Was Coming in 88. And he was prepared to put on a presentation to a state of an entire state of ministers in this organization, knowing that many of them were going to take that, perpetuate that, be back in their individual churches, telling this same message to their churches. And I was having some conflict already with the hypocrisy and some spiritual abuse and some of that. And I remember deciding in that meeting, I'm not going to put up with this anymore. And I remember the feeling that I had of stating openly, this is not genuine, it's not authentic, and it's not going to happen. It was almost like committing ministerial, at least, suicide, because I was there as a minister, part of this body of ministers, this organization. And then there was the additional feeling that, or understanding, that our calendar with the Julian calendar may be off, or the calendars may be off. And so if it doesn't happen in 88, it might happen in 92, just based on the difference of the calendars. And I do remember standing up and saying, guys, how many times are we going to go through this? What makes a scoffer a scoffer? What makes people view the faith-based community like they're just fanatics, superstitious people, believe in all kinds of fantasies and fairy tales? And it really overshadows the true power and message of the gospel, which is good news. And I remember standing up, and the feelings that I had at the moment of saying, I'm going to go on record here and say to all of us here, God is not coming. This rapture is not going to take place in 1988, and it's not going to take place in 1992. There was quite a price to pay for taking that position at the time. But here we are, 2017, and we're still here. This worldwide event did not take place. All of the fear, all of even the excitement, so many decisions that people made based on, we're going to exit here at any moment, misses the whole point of a loving God dealing with human beings, what he's wanting to put into our lives, what he wants us to understand, what we hold in our hands, and making the world a better place doesn't happen when we do these kinds of things, which is all rooted in the basis of fear. So people who believe that their number one ambition is to leave this world really have a fundamental misunderstanding of why we're here in the first place. And if you really want to follow the timeline or the understanding of who Jesus is and what he is up to, what is really happening in our world, then you have to understand that he actually prayed not that we would be taken out of this world, but that we would be blessed in it. And so if our emphasis is on getting out and we're fear-based, it's getting so bad, it's getting, our social upheaval, our political corruption, our economic chaos, you got all of these things that are being, propagated in ways to make people fearful. There are some things going on. There are some things that we need to be paying attention to, but there are also things that we can be doing, that we can be actively engaging in to make this world a much better place than it is right now. But it's very hard to do when you use the unstable economy of fear to try to establish the love of God in the earth. Love has no fear. And when love is perfected, when it's matured, when it grows up, it gets fear out of your life. And fear is there only to torment you or to threaten you with potential torment. Love actually heals. God is love. He so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, so that we had a remedy, so that we had the ability to experience love without fear and the threat of an angry God who isn't angry, but a loving God. Now, I'm not talking about getting rid of fear instinctively. You run into a Doberman Pinscher, might want to pay attention to those warning signs, might want to pay attention to that fear. That's not the fear we're talking about. We're talking about the fear as it relates specifically to our faith in the 21st century and our understanding of what God is. Comments there?
Yes. What I want to say is what happens when we're afraid, fear sends our brain back here to the survival mind.
Keep talking.
And there's only a few options: fight, flight, freeze, appease. You get paralyzed, you can't think, and all of our reason and our creativity and our options and everything is up here. And when we're thinking back here, we're easily manipulated and we become paralyzed and unable to take action. And there are things going on in the world, but if it's causing fear, it's paralyzing us as faith-based people, and we're not taking the right actions. We're reacting out of fear and unable to do things that really matter and can make a difference.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we are all going to have a response to fear. And there's also a much different response that we have to love.
Right.
One of them is very healing. The other is very damaging. There's a cartoon character, Charlie Brown, and he once said, "I've developed a new philosophy. I'm only going to dread one day at a time. And I think that's really speaks from a cartoon standpoint. It illuminates a truth, and that is the power of now, the power of living in the moment. Doesn't mean that we have to be uninformed about broader things, even things that are coming in the future. But really, what is it we are supposed to be afraid of? And so if we could just deal with one day at a time and just do what we can today to be loving, to be kind, to be compassionate, to be engaging, to let our life, not our message be our words, but let our life be our message. And so that people get a sense of who we really are, that we're not just emotional, superstitious, unfounded, without substance, misinformed, without reason, but we are people who are people of faith for a reason, and being able to express that reason to a world that would very much like to find it and understand it, but we camouflage it because of so many of the ridiculous things that we do, and this authoritarian perspective where we're exercising control over other people when we're just human beings ourselves. And it doesn't mean that we don't get into positions of influence. We need that. But it needs to be legitimate influence, not manufactured or synthetic or created, out of fear, because that's not a representation of who Jesus is, who the kingdom is, and who the people of faith really are. Tammy, thank you for joining us on this topic again, and it's always exciting to have you around. And you're going to be joining us for a couple of more sessions as we talk about faith in the 21st century. So I'll look forward to being with you again. In today's world, we have to admit it's a risky place, and it does invoke many well-founded fears, from genetically modified foods to the threat of nuclear annihilation, from climate change to sex trafficking. Our synagogues and our schools can be turned into mini mortuaries in a matter of seconds. American politics, which were designed to safeguard our individual rights, has become a runaway locomotive threatening the well-being of an entire nation. There's plenty to fear. There's plenty to be aware of and to be engaged in as a part of the solution rather than a part of the pollution. There's much to deal with that we can actually take action on to make the world a better place. So remember, whatever's going on in your world, just sprinkle a little love on it. I'm Rick Amitin, and I'll see you next time.